Before we start, I need to be very clear. This is not a party drug story, and it's not a moral lecture either. This is a story about a molecule, born from an ancient medicinal plant, getting picked up by modern industry, then weaponized by war, then sold as a miracle, and finally unleashed as a crisis that keeps reinventing itself every time society thinks it has solved it. Long before the first clandestine lab in a motel bathroom, long before the images of hollow faces and ruined teeth became shorthand for a national emergency, there was a scraggly desert shrub growing on the harsh plateaus of East Asia, ephedra. To the casual eye, it's nothing. Thin, jointed stems, tiny leaves, the kind of plant you'd step over without looking. But for thousands of years, healers in China used it for something that mattered, breathing. They brewed it into bitter tea to open airways, calm asthma, clear congestion, and push back fatigue. They didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the effect, and in medicine, effects are history's first language. The compound behind that relief, what later science would call ephedrine, was a stimulant. Not magic, not spirituality, a real measurable push on the body's systems. It tightens blood vessels, opens lungs, and tells the nervous system to wake up. For centuries, that was the size of the story, a traditional remedy, useful, limited, local. Then the late 19th century arrived with its hunger for extraction, purification, and ownership. The era when Western and Japanese chemists raced to identify the active ingredient inside plants so it could be bottled, standardized, and sold. Once ephedrine was isolated, the temptation was obvious. If nature has made a stimulant, what happens if we tweak it? That's how modern drugs are born. Not always from evil intentions, but from the very human impulse to optimize. A small modification here, an added group there, and suddenly you have something nature never produced. Methamphetamine didn't begin as a street drug. It began as a laboratory curiosity, an altered cousin of ephedrine, stronger, faster, more penetrating, and in a sense more efficient at forcing the brain into alertness and drive. The terrifying part is that, on paper, this can look like progress. A drug that fights fatigue, improves focus, suppresses appetite, lifts mood. Those are the kinds of promises societies are always ready to buy, especially societies on the edge of a crisis. And the early 20th century was nothing but crises stacked on crises. Economic collapse, industrial pressure, and then the biggest crisis of all, total war. In the 1930s, a German pharmaceutical company took methamphetamine and gave it a brand name, a clean identity, a respectable place on the shelf. It was marketed not as a weapon, but as help. A tablet that could brighten your day, energize your work, carry you through long hours. It slid neatly into a world being reshaped by the cult of productivity and national strength. In Germany, where the political atmosphere was turning poisonous and militant, the timing was almost perfect in the worst way. A stimulant fit a society that demanded output, discipline, and endurance. At first it looked like a modern wonder, something like caffeine, only sharper and more decisive. People used it the way people always use stimulants, to do more than their bodies can naturally do. Students used it to study. Workers used it to push through long shifts. Housewives used it as a pick-me-up and a weight loss aid. The language was always the same: energy, clarity, confidence, control. That's one of the oldest tricks in drug history. Sell the illusion that chemistry equals mastery over your own limits. But a stimulant like meth isn't giving you energy. It's borrowing it at a brutal interest rate, and the bill always arrives. Still, before the bill comes due, it feels incredible. And that feeling is exactly what made the drug so attractive to militaries. War doesn't just demand courage, it demands wakefulness. Modern warfare especially demands endurance. Long marches, long drives, long flights, operations that don't stop because the human body wants sleep. During World War II, militaries didn't just tolerate stimulants, they institutionalized them. The German armed forces issued methamphetamine widely because it solved an immediate tactical problem: fatigue. Soldiers could move for stretches that would normally break them. Tank crews could drive through the night. Commanders could push an offensive without the pause that defenders were counting on. If you're trying to understand why some early campaigns shocked Europe with their speed, you have to understand that part of what made impossible movement possible wasn't only strategy, it was pharmacology. This is where the story turns from medical curiosity to something darker. The first truly mass-scale experiment in chemically enhanced human performance. Millions of doses issued in uniforms, normalized by command structures, reinforced by victory. A drug becomes acceptable very quickly when it seems to win wars, and yet the side effects didn't disappear because the uniforms were clean. Extended stimulant use doesn't create super soldiers. It creates exhausted, brittle human beings running on a false sense of invincibility. Paranoia, irritability, hallucinations, reckless decisions, collapse crashes so deep they resemble coma. These effects began to surface. Some soldiers became psychologically unstable. Some units became less coherent. When the drug wears off, the nervous system doesn't return gently to baseline. It slams into a wall. And in war, a crash isn't just personal, it's operational. Even when commanders tried to restrict use, dependence had already seeped into the ranks because the experience of "I can keep going" is seductive, especially when the alternative is terror, exhaustion, and death. Once you've felt chemically unstoppable, ordinary human limits feel like betrayal. That's how dependence begins, not as a desire to get high, but as a refusal to go back to being human. And the pattern wasn't uniquely German. The Allies had their own stimulant culture. Amphetamines issued to pilots and soldiers to sustain alertness on long missions. Different molecules, similar logic. Across multiple nations, huge numbers of people learned the same lesson at the same time. There is a pill that can silence sleep. War taught that lesson to an entire generation. When the war ended, the world didn't just demobilize armies, it demobilized chemical habits. And that is where the next disaster begins, because peacetime is not a detox program. In Japan, the end of the war left behind massive stockpiles of methamphetamine, industrial quantities sitting in depots and warehouses in a society that was shattered, starving, traumatized, and flooded with demobilized soldiers who already knew exactly what the drug could do. Black markets don't require complicated ideology. They require supply and despair. Methamphetamine became cheap, plentiful escape and fuel at the same time. It helped people work longer hours in ruins, study through hunger, numb grief, keep moving when stopping meant feeling everything. And when millions of people use a powerful stimulant in a stressed society, the results are predictable: psychosis, violence, collapse, crime, overcrowded hospitals, overwhelmed institutions. A drug that feels like confidence can become aggression. A drug that feels like focus can become obsession. A drug that feels like survival can become a trap. Japan cracked down hard eventually, but even that solution came with its own costs: criminalization, underground markets, cycles of relapse. The broader lesson should have been obvious. The drug doesn't vanish, it shifts forms. Meanwhile, in the United States, stimulants took a different route into the bloodstream, through medicine and marketing. After went, pharmaceutical optimism exploded. This was the era of wonder drugs, when chemistry was sold as the engine of a better life. Amphetamines were prescribed for fatigue, depression, weight loss, and what would later be recognized more clearly as attention disorders. They were everywhere, quietly woven into the fabric of productivity. Truck drivers used them to stay awake across endless highways. Students used them to cram. Workers used them to keep pace. Women were prescribed them not just to lose weight, but to keep smiling through the pressures of an idealized domestic life. This part of the story matters for a Western audience because it reveals something uncomfortable. Stimulant culture wasn't always criminal. It was normalized by white coats and glossy ads. Society's relationship with speed began in pharmacies as much as in alleyways, and the line between medical use and social use is never as clean as laws pretend. Tolerance grows, doses escalate, crashes deepen. People learn, casually at first, that the drug isn't merely a tool. It becomes a requirement to feel normal. Addiction rarely arrives with dramatic music. It arrives quietly, disguised as coping. By the 1960s, the counterculture didn't invent drug experimentation. It inherited a pharmaceutical world already soaked in it. Street speed spread through subcultures because it did what it always does. It made people feel more awake, more alive, more capable, until it started making them more paranoid, more compulsive, more hollow. And as regulations tightened, as legitimate access narrowed, the market did what markets do. It adapted. Demand didn't disappear. It migrated. Production moved from regulated factories to clandestine labs. And when you push a potent chemistry into the shadows, you don't get safety. You get innovation without guardrails. Small-time cooks learned methods, biker networks scaled distribution, and over time, more organized criminal systems recognized methamphetamine for what it is from a business perspective, an ideal product. It can be synthesized anywhere with the right precursors. It doesn't require farmland. It doesn't need seasons. It can be produced in bulk, transported relatively easily, and sold in small units with huge profit margins. That's when the drug story stops being mainly a medical history and becomes a geopolitical one. Because once international trafficking organizations get involved, meth stops being a local problem. It becomes an economy, and economies have momentum. Now here's the cruel twist that repeats across the entire history of drugs. Every time authorities clamp down on one method, the industry finds another. Restrict ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, and you reduce small domestic labs, yes, but large-scale producers shift routes, source chemicals elsewhere, develop alternative synthesis pathways, refine purity, and flood the market again. When the product gets purer, overdose risks change. When the supply stabilizes, prices drop, usage rises, and the crisis spreads. And the human toll is never just the user. It's the children in neglected homes, the communities hollowed out by addiction and incarceration, the first responders walking into toxic lab sites, the hospitals absorbing waves of psychosis and medical collapse, the families watching someone they love become a stranger. Meth is not merely a drug. It's a force multiplier for everything that is already breaking in a person's life. Poverty, trauma, isolation, mental illness, hopelessness. That's why simple narratives fail. Just say no is too small. Lock them up is too blunt. Cut supply is too naive. The story is more disturbing because it is more human. Methamphetamine is what happens when a powerful tool meets pain, and then meets profit, and then meets policy that mistakes punishment for solution. And the most important thing to hold on to as we go forward in this documentary is this. Meth didn't become a crisis because of one villain or one cartel or one generation's bad choices. It became a crisis because modern society repeatedly rewarded the same illusion. Endless output without rest, relief without cost, power without consequence. Meth simply delivered that illusion more aggressively than almost any other molecule we've ever made. And once people, armies, and economies learned what it could do, the world couldn't unlearn it. In the next part, we'll follow how post-war pharmaceutical optimism, tightening regulation, and the rise of organized trafficking collided, how medicine became contraband, how chemistry migrated into the black market, and how the modern meth economy was built step by step, not in a single explosion, but through a series of decisions that seemed rational at the time and catastrophic in hindsight. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Hospitals were seeing patients who weren't just tired or overstimulated, but paranoid, violent, and psychotic. Doctors who had once prescribed amphetamines casually began to notice tolerance and dependency patterns they could no longer explain away. People who stopped using didn't simply feel tired. They crashed into depression so deep it could be incapacitating. The idea that amphetamines were safe when prescribed started to crumble, and governments reacted the way governments usually do when they're late to a problem, with blunt force. In the United States, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 reclassified amphetamines and methamphetamine as Schedule II drugs. This was a pivotal moment. On paper, it acknowledged the reality of addiction and abuse. In practice, it did something more complicated. Legal access tightened dramatically. Doctors became cautious. Pharmaceutical companies scaled back production under regulatory pressure. The official supply shrank, but the demand didn't. Millions of people had already learned what stimulants could do for them: keep them awake, focused, thin, productive, emotionally armored. When legitimate channels closed, the market didn't disappear, it slipped its leash. This is a fundamental rule of drug history that repeats over and over. Prohibition doesn't end use, it changes who controls supply. Once pharmaceutical meth and amphetamines became harder to obtain legally, illicit producers stepped in. At first, these were small-scale operations, often tied to biker gangs and local criminal networks. They weren't chemists in the academic sense, but they had recipes, passed hand to hand, refined through trial and error. The early illicit meth of the 1970s was inconsistent and often impure, but it filled the vacuum left by regulation. And more importantly, it marked the moment when meth fully detached from medicine and became a criminal commodity. The early black market meth scene was chaotic. Production happened in basements, garages, rural barns, anywhere secluded enough to avoid attention. The chemical process was dangerous, volatile, and filthy. Explosions were common. Toxic waste was dumped into rivers, fields, and drains. For every pound of meth produced, multiple pounds of poisonous byproduct were left behind. Entire properties became hazardous zones. But from the perspective of producers, the risks were acceptable because the profits were immediate and substantial. This is the point where meth stopped being a drug problem and became an environmental, public safety, and law enforcement nightmare all at once. As the 1980s arrived, two developments changed the scale of the crisis completely. The first was chemical. Illicit producers rediscovered and refined synthesis methods that were more efficient and yielded stronger product. One of these methods, based on ephedrine reduction, was brutally effective. It produced methamphetamine that was significantly purer than earlier street versions, and it relied on precursor chemicals that were at the time legally available in cold and allergy medications. Suddenly, anyone with enough knowledge and nerve could cook a powerful stimulant using materials bought at a pharmacy. The second development was organizational. Large-scale criminal groups, particularly in Mexico, recognized methamphetamine's business potential earlier than most governments did. Unlike drugs that require agricultural cycles, like coca or opium, meth could be produced year-round, anywhere, with consistent output. It didn't depend on weather, land, or seasons. It depended on chemistry and logistics. For cartels already skilled at trafficking, this was a perfect product. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, methamphetamine production began shifting south of the US border. What had started as scattered domestic labs slowly transformed into an industrial operation. Cartels built large-scale facilities capable of producing massive quantities of high-purity meth. These weren't amateur setups. They used industrial glassware, trained chemists, controlled processes, and supply chains that stretched across continents. Precursor chemicals flowed in from Asia. Finished product flowed north. This transition had devastating consequences. The meth that flooded into the United States in the 1990s was cheaper, stronger, and more consistent than anything before it. Prices dropped, availability skyrocketed, use spread beyond subcultures and into rural towns, working-class communities, and places that had previously been spared the worst of earlier drug waves. Unlike heroin or crack, meth didn't sedate users, it energized them. It fit seamlessly into economies built on long hours, physical labor, and insecurity. People used it to work longer shifts, to stay awake on construction sites, to drive trucks across states, to survive multiple jobs with no margin for rest. This is where meth's cultural footprint becomes especially important to understand. In many communities, it wasn't seen as a party drug, it was a work drug, a survival drug, something that allowed people to keep going when the economic system demanded more than their bodies could give. That doesn't excuse the damage, but it explains why meth spread so deeply in places hollowed out by job loss, declining wages, and isolation. Addiction didn't arrive as rebellion. It arrived disguised as utility. Authorities responded with another crackdown, this time focused on precursor control. In the United States, laws were passed to restrict access to ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. Cold medicines were moved behind pharmacy counters. Purchase limits were imposed. ID logs were required. And for a moment, it looked like progress. Small domestic meth labs collapsed almost overnight. Lab seizures dropped dramatically. News headlines declared victories. But once again, the celebration was premature. The crackdown eliminated local cooks, but it strengthened the cartels. With domestic competition gone, international producers filled the gap completely. Super labs in Mexico ramped up production. Smuggling routes expanded. Purity increased even further. The meth that returned to the US market after these restrictions wasn't weaker, it was stronger, cheaper, and more abundant. The problem hadn't been solved, it had been consolidated. By the early 2000s, methamphetamine had fully evolved into its modern form, ultra-high purity, mass-produced, globally trafficked, and embedded in transnational criminal economies. This new meth was more addictive and more destructive. Users accustomed to weaker product overdosed easily. Psychosis became more common. Long-term neurological damage became more visible. And the human cost expanded outward, to children removed from homes, to communities destabilized, to first responders dealing with hazardous sites and extreme violence. At the same time, the criminal justice response followed a familiar script. Users were arrested, low-level dealers were imprisoned, jails filled, treatment options lagged far behind enforcement, stigma hardened, addiction was framed as moral failure rather than medical crisis. And because meth addiction often presents with visible deterioration, skin lesions, erratic behavior, paranoia, public sympathy was scarce. This made punitive policies politically easy, even as they failed repeatedly. What makes meth different from many other drugs is how deeply it rewires the brain. It doesn't just stimulate, it overwhelms. Dopamine levels spike far beyond natural rewards. Over time, the brain adapts by reducing its own ability to feel pleasure. When users stop, the world feels empty, flat, and hostile. Recovery becomes not just about resisting cravings, but about relearning how to experience life at all. This is why relapse rates are so high and why treatment is so difficult. There is no simple medication that reverses meth addiction. Recovery is slow, fragile, and deeply dependent on support structures that many users don't have. By the time policymakers fully grasped the scale of the meth crisis, the drug was already global. Southeast Asia saw explosive growth in tablet meth. Australia faced a severe ice epidemic. Eastern Europe developed its own localized production. Wherever supply chains could form and social stress existed, meth followed. It adapted to cultures, economies, and enforcement strategies with ruthless efficiency. The most sobering lesson of this phase of the story is that meth didn't spread because societies were careless. It spread because they were reactive. Each response addressed yesterday's version of the problem, while the drug quietly evolved into tomorrow's. Regulation created black markets. Crackdowns strengthened organized crime. Punishment displaced treatment. And through it all, the people most affected were the least equipped to escape. By the time methamphetamine entered the 21st century, it was no longer a rogue chemical slipping through the cracks of regulation. It was a fully matured system. Production, trafficking, and consumption had aligned into something disturbingly efficient, and the scale of it dwarfed anything that came before. This is the phase where meth stops being a national problem and becomes a global one, where the drug's chemistry, economics, and human consequences fuse into a crisis that resists simple solutions. The most important shift to understand is purity. Earlier generations of meth were inconsistent. Potency varied wildly, contamination was common, and users often had no idea what they were taking. Modern meth is different. Advances in synthesis, combined with cartel-level quality control, have produced a drug that regularly exceeds 90–95% purity. From a chemical standpoint, this is almost pharmaceutical-grade material, but without any of the safeguards. The danger of this purity cannot be overstated. High-purity meth changes how the body reacts. It crosses the blood-brain barrier faster, hits harder, lasts longer, and places extreme strain on the cardiovascular and nervous systems. Users who built tolerance on weaker product are suddenly pushed past physiological limits they didn't know existed. Overdoses spike not because people suddenly want to die, but because the margin for error has vanished. At the same time, meth's role in the broader overdose crisis has become more complex. For years, public attention focused primarily on opioids, heroin and later fentanyl, and with good reason. But meth didn't fade into the background. Instead, it began intersecting with opioid use in lethal ways. Some users take meth to counteract the sedation of opioids, trying to stay awake or functional. Others encounter fentanyl unknowingly mixed into stimulant supplies. The result is a deadly overlap. Stimulants masking opioid overdose symptoms until it's too late, or the stimulant crash amplifying respiratory suppression. Deaths involving meth have risen dramatically, and in many regions they now rival or exceed opioid-only fatalities. What makes meth uniquely destabilizing compared to many other substances is its psychiatric impact. Long-term use doesn't just impair judgment, it can fundamentally fracture a person's sense of reality. Meth-induced psychosis can mimic paranoid schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, delusions of surveillance, intense fear, and aggression. Unlike short-lived intoxication, these symptoms can persist for weeks or months after use stops, and in some cases, they become permanent. Emergency rooms and psychiatric wards see this daily. People brought in not just high, but terrified, convinced they are being hunted, unable to distinguish threat from imagination. Law enforcement encounters the same individuals not as criminals in the traditional sense, but as people in acute psychological crisis, unpredictable and sometimes violent. This blurs the line between public health and public safety in ways few systems are prepared to handle. The social fallout spreads outward quickly. Families collapse under the strain. Children are exposed to neglect, abuse, and environmental toxins from makeshift labs or heavy use. Entire households become unstable. In rural and small-town America, where resources are thin to begin with, child welfare systems are overwhelmed. Foster care networks break under the weight. Schools absorb the consequences in the form of traumatized students who struggle to learn, trust, or regulate emotion. These are long-term effects, not temporary ones, and they ripple across generations. Meanwhile, communities themselves begin to change shape. Businesses close as theft increases and foot traffic disappears. Housing stock degrades when properties are abandoned or contaminated. Emergency services are stretched thin, responding to overdoses, fires, domestic disturbances, and hazardous materials incidents. Hospitals absorb uncompensated care costs. Jails fill with people cycling through short sentences that do nothing to address the underlying addiction. The economic damage is massive, but it's often invisible because it's distributed across systems. Healthcare, law enforcement, social services, education, environmental cleanup. No single agency sees the whole bill, but society pays it anyway. At the center of this system are the cartels, and it's critical to understand them not as chaotic gangs, but as structured enterprises. Modern meth production is vertically integrated. Cartels control precursor acquisition, synthesis, transportation, wholesale distribution, and often retail networks. They operate with business logic, minimizing costs, maximizing output, adapting rapidly to regulation. When one precursor is restricted, another is substituted. When one route is blocked, another opens. When enforcement pressure increases in one region, production shifts geographically. This adaptability is not accidental. It's the result of decades of experience navigating prohibition-based markets. The global nature of precursor chemicals adds another layer of complexity. Many of the substances used to produce meth have legitimate industrial or pharmaceutical uses. They are manufactured legally in massive quantities, particularly in parts of Asia, and then diverted into illicit channels. Regulating this flow requires international cooperation, enforcement capacity, and political will that often fall short. Even when agreements exist on paper, enforcement gaps remain. The chemical supply chain is simply too vast, too diffuse, and too profitable to control with traditional methods alone. Against this backdrop, the dominant policy response, criminalization, shows its limits more clearly than ever. Arresting users does not reduce demand. Incarceration does not treat addiction, and focusing enforcement on low-level distribution leaves the core of the system intact. In many cases, prison exacerbates the very conditions that drive relapse: trauma, isolation, lack of opportunity. People are released with criminal records, diminished prospects, and untreated substance use disorders, almost guaranteeing return to use. The system churns, but the outcomes barely change. Some countries and regions have experimented with different approaches, treating addiction as a public health issue rather than a moral failure. Where treatment access expands, where harm reduction strategies are implemented, where stigma is actively challenged, outcomes improve. Overdose deaths decline, disease transmission drops, crime stabilizes. These examples don't represent utopia, but they demonstrate something crucial. Meth addiction is not immutable. It responds to environment, policy, and support. Yet scaling these approaches remains politically difficult, especially in societies that equate punishment with accountability. Meth's visible damage makes compassion harder. The drug strips users of social acceptability, reinforcing narratives that they are beyond help. This narrative is convenient, it absolves society of responsibility, but it is also false. Recovery does happen. Brains heal slowly. People rebuild lives, but they rarely do so alone, and they almost never do so in systems designed primarily to punish them. The first answer is demand. Methamphetamine does not spread randomly, it follows pressure points in society. Wherever people are expected to work longer, sleep less, compete harder, and survive with fewer resources, stimulants find fertile ground. In many Western countries, especially the United States, the economic structure of the last 40 years has quietly created ideal conditions for meth use. Deindustrialization hollowed out stable jobs, wages stagnated, healthcare became expensive or inaccessible, social mobility slowed. In rural and post-industrial areas, opportunity narrowed while expectations remained high. Meth filled the gap between what people were asked to give and what their bodies and minds could sustain. Unlike depressants, meth doesn't remove you from the world. It keeps you in it, hyper-present, hyper-focused, hyper-engaged. For someone juggling multiple jobs, caring responsibilities, debt, and constant stress that can feel less like escapism and more like survival. This is one reason meth has proven so resilient. It aligns with a culture that glorifies endurance and productivity while offering little protection from burnout. The drug doesn't create these pressures, it exploits them. The second answer is treatment failure. Despite the scale of the crisis, effective treatment for meth addiction remains limited, underfunded, and unevenly distributed. There is no equivalent to methadone or buprenorphine for stimulants. Recovery relies heavily on behavioral therapies that require time, stability, and professional support. Resources many users simply don't have. Long waiting lists, lack of insurance coverage, geographic isolation, and stigma all act as barriers. The result is a grim paradox. The drug that causes some of the most severe psychological damage is also the one for which treatment access is often weakest. Relapse in this context is not a moral failure. It is a predictable outcome of inadequate support. Meth rewires the brain's reward system so aggressively that months or even years of abstinence may be required before pleasure, motivation, and emotional regulation begin to normalize. Expecting people to endure that process without housing, employment, or social support is unrealistic. And yet that is often exactly what systems demand. The third answer is policy inertia. Drug policy in many Western nations remains trapped in a feedback loop. Public fear leads to punitive laws. Punitive laws fail. Failure leads to more fear and harsher measures. This cycle is politically convenient, but practically disastrous. It creates the appearance of action while avoiding structural change. Meanwhile, the most harmful consequences, mass incarceration, community destabilization, generational trauma, are absorbed quietly by the same populations already at risk. Enforcement-heavy approaches also produce a perverse incentive structure. When supply is disrupted locally, prices may rise temporarily, increasing profits for those who can adapt. Large criminal organizations are best positioned to do exactly that. Over time, prohibition doesn't eliminate markets, it concentrates them. Meth's evolution from small domestic labs to cartel-controlled superproduction is a textbook example. Each crackdown removed competitors and strengthened the survivors. Another uncomfortable reality is stigma. Meth users are often portrayed as irredeemable, dangerous, unstable, beyond help. This narrative strips them of empathy and political relevance. It makes it easier to ignore underfunded treatment systems, overcrowded jails, and traumatized children. But stigma doesn't just harm users, it harms policy. When society views a population as disposable, it stops investing in solutions that would actually work. There are, however, alternative models that challenge this fatalism. Countries that have shifted toward public health-centered approaches, emphasizing treatment, harm reduction, and reintegration, have seen measurable improvements. Decriminalization of possession, when paired with accessible treatment and social support, does not increase drug use. It reduces overdose deaths, lowers disease transmission, and improves long-term outcomes. These results are not theoretical, they are documented. What's lacking is not evidence, but willingness. Harm reduction, in particular, is often misunderstood. It is not an endorsement of drug use, it is an acknowledgement of reality. People use drugs whether laws approve or not. Providing clean supplies, safe spaces, and accurate information reduces deaths and creates contact points where treatment becomes possible. Every life saved is a chance for recovery later. Every overdose prevented is a family spared irreversible loss. There is also growing recognition that prevention must begin far upstream. Meth addiction rarely emerges in isolation. It is closely linked to childhood trauma, untreated mental illness, social isolation, and economic insecurity. Addressing these root causes through education, mental health services, stable housing, and employment opportunities is not soft, it is strategic. Addiction thrives in chaos. Stability starves it. Yet even with better policy and treatment, meth will not disappear. The molecule exists, the knowledge exists, the global chemical industry exists. The realistic goal is not eradication, but harm minimization, reducing use, reducing deaths, reducing damage, and increasing recovery. This requires abandoning the fantasy of a drug-free society and replacing it with a commitment to a healthier one. Perhaps the most important shift required is cultural. Western societies have long celebrated chemical solutions to human limits. Caffeine, nicotine, prescription stimulants, productivity hacks. Meth is the extreme expression of that same impulse. Until we confront the values that reward constant output over well-being, the conditions that fuel stimulant addiction will persist. Meth is not an anomaly. It is a warning. Recovery from methamphetamine addiction is unlike recovery from almost any other drug. There is no quick reset, no chemical shortcut back to normal. When someone stops using meth, they are not simply sober. They are neurologically impaired in ways that are invisible to the outside world, but brutally real to the person experiencing them. The brain's dopamine system, the machinery that allows humans to feel pleasure, motivation, curiosity, and hope, has been flattened. Everyday experiences feel empty. Food tastes dull. Music feels meaningless. Relationships feel distant. Time stretches unbearably. This state can last months, sometimes years, and during that window, relapse is not temptation, it feels like relief. This is where many treatment systems fail. They are designed around short timelines and limited resources, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. But meth recovery does not respect calendar boxes. A person may leave treatment technically clean, while still neurologically unable to feel joy or purpose. Without long-term support, housing stability, employment pathways, and mental health care, abstinence becomes a fragile, lonely experiment. The drug didn't just change behavior, it changed the brain. Expecting willpower alone to undo that is unrealistic. Some of the most promising treatment models focus not on punishment or abstinence alone, but on rebuilding reward systems. Contingency management, for example, uses structured incentives, small financial rewards, vouchers, privileges to reinforce drug-free behavior. To outsiders, this can sound offensive. Why reward people for not using drugs? But neuroscience tells a different story. When natural rewards don't register, artificial ones can temporarily substitute, keeping people engaged long enough for the brain to heal. Over time, as dopamine systems recover, external rewards can be phased out. This approach doesn't rely on moral judgment, it relies on biology. Cognitive behavioral therapy also plays a central role, but only when delivered consistently and accessibly. It helps people recognize triggers, dismantle distorted thinking, and rebuild coping strategies that don't rely on chemical stimulation. But CBT is not a cure, it is a tool. Without addressing trauma, housing insecurity, unemployment, and social isolation, therapy alone is often overwhelmed by reality. This brings us to one of the most neglected truths in the meth crisis. Housing is treatment, stability is treatment, safety is treatment. People do not recover in chaos. Countries and cities that have adopted housing-first models providing stable housing without requiring sobriety as a precondition, have seen better long-term outcomes for people with severe substance use disorders. The logic is simple but counterintuitive to punitive systems. Once someone has a safe place to sleep, store belongings, and exist without constant threat, recovery becomes possible. Without that foundation, relapse is almost inevitable. Employment is another pillar. Meth addiction often destroys work history, references, and confidence. Even after recovery begins, criminal records and stigma shut doors. Programs that provide supported employment, jobs with structure, understanding, and flexibility do more than generate income. They restore identity. They give people a reason to wake up that doesn't come in a bag or a pipe. Purpose is one of the strongest protective factors against relapse, yet it is rarely treated as such in policy design. At the same time, science is not standing still. Researchers are exploring pharmacological options that could ease meth recovery. Some medications aim to stabilize dopamine signaling without producing euphoria. Others target cravings or stress responses that trigger relapse. There is even experimental work on vaccines that would prevent meth from crossing the blood-brain barrier, blocking its effects entirely. These approaches are not silver bullets, and none are widely available yet, but they represent a shift away from resignation toward innovation. However, no treatment breakthrough will succeed in isolation if policy continues to funnel users into jails rather than clinics. Incarceration interrupts lives but rarely heals brains. Worse, release from prison is one of the highest risk periods for overdose and relapse, especially when tolerance has dropped and support is minimal. If the goal is public safety, cycling people through cages without treatment is not just ineffective, it is dangerous. The future of the meth crisis will be shaped less by chemistry than by choices. Societies can choose to double down on punishment, accepting high death tolls as collateral damage. Or they can choose to treat addiction as what it is, a chronic medical condition with social roots and biological consequences. That choice determines where resources flow, which lives are valued, and whether the cycle tightens or loosens. There is also a cultural reckoning underway. Meth forces an uncomfortable conversation about productivity, exhaustion, and worth. It exposes how many people feel pressured to perform beyond human limits, and how easily chemical shortcuts fill that gap. As long as success is measured by output alone, stimulants will retain their appeal. Addressing meth at scale requires questioning the systems that reward burnout and punish rest. None of this guarantees an easy ending. Methamphetamine has embedded itself too deeply for clean resolutions. But history shows that harm is not fixed. It responds to policy, compassion, and investment. Recovery stories exist not because meth is weak, but because humans are resilient when given real support. The tragedy is not that meth is powerful. It's that our responses have so often been smaller than the problem. Methamphetamine began as a molecule, not a menace. It did not announce itself as destruction. It arrived wearing the language of medicine, productivity, and progress. It promised focus, stamina, relief from fatigue, relief from hunger, relief from despair. And for a while, it delivered exactly that. The problem was never that meth didn't work. The problem was that it worked too well, by bypassing the body's natural limits instead of respecting them. Every time it was used to solve a problem, it quietly created a larger one downstream. History shows us a repeating pattern. First, a substance is discovered and framed as useful. Then it is commercialized and normalized. Then harms become visible. Then regulation arrives late and heavy-handed. Then the market adapts. Then criminal networks step in. Then society blames users. Then the cycle restarts. Methamphetamine did not invent this pattern. It simply exposed it more brutally than most drugs ever have. One of the most important lessons in this history is that supply-side thinking alone will always fail. You cannot out-police chemistry. You cannot arrest your way out of a market fueled by demand, despair, and profit. Every attempt to choke off meth production has resulted in a more concentrated, more sophisticated, and more violent supply chain. Every attempt to scare users into abstinence has underestimated the power of neurobiology and trauma. The war on meth, like the war on drugs more broadly, has been a war on symptoms rather than causes. Another hard truth is that meth is not evenly distributed. It does not strike randomly. It clusters where people are economically expendable, socially isolated, and psychologically overwhelmed. Rural towns hollowed out by job loss, post-industrial regions with little access to healthcare, communities where mental illness goes untreated and rest is treated as weakness. Meth thrives in these environments because it temporarily masks pain and increases output until it destroys the very people using it to survive. This is why stigma is so dangerous. When society reduces meth users to caricatures, tweakers, junkies, lost causes, it stops asking why the drug took hold in their lives. Stigma shuts down curiosity, and without curiosity, policy calcifies. Compassion is not softness, it is clarity. You cannot solve a problem you refuse to understand. The science is clear, meth addiction is a brain disorder. It alters dopamine signaling, impairs judgment, distorts perception, and damages emotional regulation. These changes are real, measurable, and often long-lasting. Expecting someone in this state to simply choose better without support is like expecting someone with a broken leg to run uphill. Recovery is possible, but it requires time, safety, and sustained care. Anything less is performance, not policy. The future response to meth will determine more than overdose statistics. It will determine whether societies choose management or healing. Management looks like overcrowded jails, revolving door arrests, emergency rooms filled with repeat crises, and communities slowly eroding under the weight of untreated addiction. Healing looks like treatment on demand, housing as a foundation, mental health care as a right, and policies grounded in evidence rather than fear. There are reasons for cautious hope. Research into stimulant addiction is advancing. Harm reduction models are proving their worth. Communities that invest in treatment and prevention are seeing results. The narrative is slowly shifting, from punishment toward public health, from blame toward responsibility. But progress is uneven, and resistance is strong. Old ideas die hard, especially when they are politically convenient. What meth ultimately forces us to confront is a larger question. What kind of society are we willing to be? One that demands constant productivity without protection, one that treats suffering as personal failure, or one that recognizes human limits and builds systems that honor them. Meth is not an alien invasion, it is a stress test, and in many places the system failed. The molecule created in a laboratory over a century ago cannot be erased. It will exist tomorrow whether we like it or not. The choice is not whether meth disappears, but whether its impact continues to be catastrophic. That choice is made not in chemistry labs, but in legislatures, hospitals, schools, workplaces, and communities. Behind every statistic is a person, someone's child, someone's parent, someone who once had plans, routines, relationships, and hope. Meth did not erase their humanity. It exploited their vulnerability. Remembering that is not sentimentality. It is the foundation of any response that actually works. This story does not end with a miracle cure or a final victory. It ends with responsibility. Responsibility to learn from history instead of repeating it. Responsibility to replace fear with evidence. Responsibility to treat addiction not as a moral verdict, but as a call to do better. The shadow meth has cast is long, but But shadows only exist where there is light, and light in this story looks like compassion backed by science, policy guided by reality, and a refusal to accept mass suffering as inevitable. If this documentary has changed how you see methamphetamine, not just as a drug, but as a reflection of society, then the story has done its job. Because understanding is where change begins. In towns hit hardest by meth, the drug changes social behavior long before it changes crime data. People stop locking doors because of fear and start locking them because trust has eroded. Neighbors who once borrowed tools now avoid eye contact. Community events thin out. Churches, schools, and local businesses become informal crisis managers, absorbing problems they were never designed to handle. Teachers learn to recognize the signs of stimulant neglect in children, exhaustion, hypervigilance, emotional volatility, long before any official report is filed. Emergency rooms quietly adapt to a steady flow of psychosis cases, learning how to de-escalate fear-driven aggression without enough beds, staff, or time. Children are often the most invisible victims. Growing up in meth-affected homes doesn't always mean overt violence. More often it means chaos, unpredictable moods, sleep deprivation, food insecurity, adults who are present physically but absent emotionally. Kids learn early how to stay quiet, how to read danger, how to survive. These coping skills look like maturity from the outside, but often mask deep trauma. Long-term studies show higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, and difficulty forming stable relationships later in life. Meth doesn't just damage one generation, it echoes into the next. First responders carry another layer of the burden. Police officers, paramedics, and firefighters encounter meth not as an abstract problem, but as a daily reality. Volatile scenes, unpredictable behavior, hazardous environments. Responding to meth-related calls means exposure to toxic chemicals, needle stick risks, fires, explosions, and severe psychological stress. Many first responders develop PTSD symptoms, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, sleep disorders, yet stigma within their own professions often prevents them from seeking help. The system treats them as armor, not as people. Healthcare workers face a different strain. Treating meth-related conditions is resource-intensive and often demoralizing. There is no simple protocol. Patients cycle in and out. Psychosis returns, follow-up is rare, compassion fatigue sets in. And yet, these same workers are often the only point of human connection left for people who have been rejected everywhere else. Small moments, being treated with dignity, being listened to without judgment, can matter more than any medication in keeping someone alive long enough to recover. What becomes clear at this level is that meth is not just a drug of despair. It is a drug of disconnection. Isolation fuels use, and use deepens isolation. Breaking that loop requires more than enforcement or treatment slots. It requires rebuilding social fabric. Peer support programs, recovery communities, and lived experience advocates have proven especially powerful because they restore something meth destroys quickly: belonging. People are far more likely to pursue recovery when they see it embodied in someone who understands their reality, not preached from above. This is also where language matters. The words we use, addict, tweaker, junkie, shape policy and perception. They turned people into problems instead of people with problems. When language dehumanizes, solutions shrink. When language recognizes complexity, solutions expand. Shifting language is not political correctness, it is strategic accuracy. You cannot solve what you misname. There are places where communities have begun to turn the tide, not by erasing meth, but by shrinking its reach. Integrated response models that combine treatment, housing, mental health care, employment support, and community accountability show measurable success. These programs are not cheap, but they are far less expensive than endless incarceration, emergency care, and child welfare intervention. The cost question is not whether we can afford humane solutions, it's whether we can afford not to implement them. One of the most powerful insights from these efforts is that recovery is rarely linear. Relapse is common. Progress comes in steps, not leaps. Systems that treat relapse as failure push people out. Systems that treat relapse as information, signals about unmet needs, pull people back in. That difference determines whether someone dies or eventually recovers. At this stage, the meth crisis forces a moral decision as much as a practical one. Do we design systems to filter people out or to pull them back in? Do we accept a permanent underclass of chemically exiled humans, or do we invest in reintegration? These are not abstract questions. They determine budget priorities, zoning laws, healthcare funding, and criminal justice practices. One of the most significant changes already underway is how drugs are bought and sold. The old image of street corners and back-alley dealers is increasingly outdated. Today's meth market operates through encrypted messaging apps, online marketplaces, and delivery-style distribution networks. Buyers don't need to navigate dangerous neighborhoods. They place orders from phones. Sellers don't need visible territory. They rely on logistics. This reduces friction, increases reach, and normalizes use in populations that previously had less exposure. When access becomes easier and safer from a consumer's perspective, use spreads, not because people suddenly want drugs more, but because the barriers have fallen. At the same time, drug production is becoming more technologically sophisticated. Cartels and criminal organizations are no longer improvising, they are optimizing. They use data, chemical expertise, and global supply chains to refine purity, consistency, and cost efficiency. As artificial intelligence and automation become more accessible, these tools will not be exclusive to governments or corporations. Illicit networks will use them too, for route optimization, demand forecasting, evasion strategies, and chemical synthesis modeling. The uncomfortable reality is that prohibition markets reward innovation. The more pressure applied, the more creative and resilient the supply becomes. Another looming issue is chemical substitution. Whenever a precursor or synthesis method is restricted, producers adapt by finding alternatives. These alternatives are often less studied, less predictable, and sometimes more dangerous. This pattern has already played out with synthetic opioids. There is no reason to believe stimulants will be different. Future meth-like substances may be easier to manufacture, harder to detect, and even more potent. Regulation that focuses narrowly on known compounds risks always being one step behind. The globalization of chemical manufacturing compounds this risk. Many precursor substances have legitimate industrial uses and are produced in enormous quantities worldwide. Policing their diversion requires international cooperation that is often slow, fragmented, and politically sensitive. Even when agreements exist, enforcement varies dramatically by region. This creates predictable weak points, places where oversight is lax, corruption is high, or resources are limited. Criminal networks exploit these gaps with precision. There is also a demographic shift underway. Meth use is no longer confined to stereotypical profiles. It is appearing more frequently among older adults, professionals, and people with no prior history of illicit drug use, often through prescription stimulant misuse that escalates or transitions into illicit supply. The line between medical and non-medical stimulant use continues to blur, raising difficult questions about prescribing practices, monitoring, and long-term risk. This is not about demonizing legitimate medications, but about acknowledging that familiarity lowers psychological barriers. Mental health trends further complicate the picture. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, and burnout have risen sharply across Western societies. Social media Economic precarity and constant digital stimulation have reshaped attention and reward systems. In this environment, powerful stimulants have renewed appeal, not just as escape, but as performance tools. If meth's history has shown us anything, it's that substances thrive when they align with cultural pressures. Right now, many of those pressures are intensifying, not easing. Yet the future is not predetermined. The same technologies that enable trafficking can also support prevention, early intervention, and treatment. Data analytics can identify overdose clusters faster. Telemedicine can expand access to therapy and recovery support in remote areas. Education can be targeted more precisely, grounded in evidence rather than fear. None of these tools matter, however, without political and social commitment to use them for health rather than control. The greatest risk moving forward is repeating familiar mistakes. Responding to new stimulant threats with the same punitive reflexes will almost certainly produce the same outcomes: stronger drugs, more powerful criminal networks, and higher death tolls. History does not suggest otherwise. What it suggests is that adaptability, compassion, and evidence-based policy are not luxuries, they are necessities. Real prevention begins long before a person ever encounters methamphetamine. It starts in places that drug policy rarely prioritizes: childhood stability, mental health care, education, housing, and economic security. If enforcement and treatment are the emergency responses, prevention is the infrastructure, and meth's history shows what happens when that infrastructure is weak or absent. One of the strongest predictors of later substance use is early life trauma. Adverse childhood experiences, abuse, neglect, household instability, untreated mental illness in caregivers reshape the brain's stress and reward systems. These changes don't disappear with age. They increase vulnerability to substances that provide relief, control, or emotional escape. Meth is especially potent in this context because it temporarily silences fear, fatigue, and sadness. Prevention, therefore, is inseparable from child welfare. Safe homes, trauma-informed. Education and accessible mental health support are not social extras. They are drug prevention strategies with the strongest evidence base we have. Schools play a critical role here, but not through scare tactics or zero-tolerance policies. Programs that focus on emotional regulation, stress management, and resilience consistently outperform fear-based messaging. Young people who can identify emotions, tolerate discomfort, and seek help are less likely to rely on chemicals for relief. Honest education, grounded in neuroscience and lived reality, builds credibility. When institutions exaggerate or moralize, they lose trust. Meth's real dangers are severe enough without distortion. Mental health care access is another cornerstone. Anxiety, depression, ADHD, and trauma-related disorders are often untreated or undertreated, especially in rural and low-income communities. People self-medicate when legitimate care is unavailable, unaffordable, or stigmatized. Expanding mental health services through community clinics, telehealth, and integration with primary care reduces the appeal of illicit stimulants by addressing the pain that drives use in the first place. Housing stability cannot be overstated. Housing insecurity magnifies every risk factor associated with meth use and relapse. People without stable shelter are more likely to use substances, less likely to complete treatment, and far more likely to cycle through emergency services and incarceration. Prevention strategies that ignore housing are incomplete by definition. Stable housing creates the conditions where prevention messages, therapy, and recovery can actually take hold. Economic policy also functions as drug policy, whether acknowledged or not. Communities with limited job opportunities, precarious work, and low wages experience higher rates of stimulant use. Meth thrives where endurance is demanded, but support is absent. Job training, living wages, and employment pathways for people with criminal records are not just economic interventions, they reduce the incentive to rely on chemical endurance. Another underused prevention lever is early intervention. Many people show warning signs long before full addiction develops. Escalating stimulant misuse, sleep deprivation, paranoia, emotional volatility. Systems that respond early, with support rather than punishment, can interrupt progression. This requires training educators, healthcare providers, and employers to recognize signs and respond appropriately. It also requires removing fear. People are less likely to seek help if disclosure leads to arrest or job loss. At the community level, social connection is protective. Isolation accelerates addiction. Belonging slows it. Community centers, peer groups, recovery networks, and culturally relevant support systems create buffers against meth's pull. These spaces don't need to be grand or expensive. They need to be consistent and trustworthy. Prevention is often quiet, work invisible until it succeeds. Technology also has a role to play. Data-driven public health monitoring can identify emerging patterns before they explode into crises. Wastewater analysis, for example, has already been used to detect rising drug use in specific regions, allowing for targeted intervention. Digital tools can deliver education, counseling, and peer support discreetly to people who might never walk into a clinic. Perhaps the hardest prevention challenge is cultural. Western societies continue to reward overwork, sleep deprivation, and constant availability. Stimulants thrive in cultures that treat exhaustion as a personal failure instead of a systemic warning. Redefining success to include rest, balance, and mental health is not abstract idealism. It is a practical defense against stimulant dependence. As this documentary moves toward its conclusion, the central insight becomes unavoidable. Methamphetamine is not just a chemical problem. It is a reflection of how societies manage stress, inequality, trauma, and productivity. Prevention that ignores these dimensions will always be partial and fragile. This is where the story closes its circle, not with a solution that erases methamphetamine from the world, but with clarity about what this history actually demands of us. From an ancient plant used to ease breathing, to a laboratory modification meant to improve medicine, to a wartime performance enhancer, to a global illicit economy, meth's journey exposes a recurring human mistake. We keep mistaking chemical power for progress, speed for strength, and punishment for prevention. Methamphetamine did not hijack society from the outside. Society invited it in. We asked for more output, more endurance, more focus, more resilience, often without offering stability, rest, or care in return. Meth delivered on those demands temporarily at a devastating cost, and when the damage became visible, our response was not to rethink the demands, but to criminalize the damage. What this history shows, again and again, is that control without care fails. We controlled supply, and supply adapted. We punished users, and addiction deepened. We chased symptoms and ignored causes. Each phase felt decisive in the moment, and each produced unintended consequences that made the next phase worse. Meth did not become powerful because it was evil. It became powerful because our systems rewarded exactly what it offers in the short term. There is no honest ending where meth simply disappears. The molecule exists, the knowledge exists, the global chemical infrastructure exists. The choice we face is not eradication, but orientation. Do we orient policy toward fear and punishment, or toward health and prevention? Do we continue managing fallout, or do we invest upstream where damage can actually be reduced? The evidence is no longer ambiguous. Treatment works better than incarceration. Housing stabilizes recovery. Early mental health care prevents escalation. Harm reduction saves lives and creates pathways to change. Compassion reduces stigma. and reduced stigma increases help-seeking. None of these approaches are radical experiments anymore. They are documented realities where they have been tried with seriousness and scale, but adopting them requires something deeper than new laws. It requires a cultural shift. Meth's story forces us to confront how we value people, whether we see those who fall into addiction as expendable or as citizens worth investing in, whether we measure success by punishment delivered or by harm reduced, whether we are willing to accept complexity instead of clinging to simple villains. It also requires humility from science and industry. Meth reminds us that powerful tools demand foresight, restraint, and accountability. Innovation without ethical reflection can create problems that outlive their creators. The chemists who modified ephedrine did not intend a global epidemic, but intention does not negate responsibility. The lesson is not to fear science, but to govern it wisely. For policymakers, the responsibility is clear. Stop repeating strategies that have already failed. Invest in treatment infrastructure at the scale of the problem. Align drug policy with public health. Coordinate internationally on precursor control while recognizing that supply-side efforts alone will never be enough. Measure success by lives stabilized, not arrests made. For communities, the responsibility is relational. Rebuild trust, support recovery visibly, replace isolation with belonging. Fund programs that keep families intact and children safe. Understand that relapse is not proof of failure, it is proof that healing takes time. For individuals, the responsibility is empathy. To recognize that addiction is not a distant other, but a human response to pain, pressure, and availability. To challenge language that dehumanizes. To support evidence-based approaches even when fear makes punishment feel satisfying. Methamphetamine's history is often described as dark, and it is, but darkness is not the final message. The deeper message is exposure. Meth exposes where societies are brittle, where support is missing, where speed is valued over sustainability, where suffering is punished instead of treated. In that sense, meth is less a cause than a signal. The story is still being written. Every recovery, every policy shift, every community that chooses prevention over reaction adds a different line to the ending. There will be setbacks, there will be resistance, but history shows that change is possible when understanding replaces denial. If this documentary has done anything, it should have dismantled the myth that meth is a problem with a simple enemy and a simple fix. It is a mirror, and what it reflects back is uncomfortable but necessary. Because only by facing that reflection can we stop repeating the same cycle under a different name. The shadow meth casts is long, but it is not destiny. The path forward exists. It is slower, more complex, and far more humane than what came before, and that ultimately is the real lesson of methamphetamine's history. The most powerful response is not control, but care, guided by evidence, sustained by compassion, and committed for the long term.